Hey, Oscar. Should we see what Leaf's up to? All right, let's do that. Hey, Leaf, what you doing?
I was sitting here playing a wonderful game of Super Mario World.
Super Nintendo? Lame. Everybody knows that Genesis does what Nintendo don't.
No, 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 no. Super Nintendo is what Genesis isn't.
Oh, snap. Hey everyone, Co33 here with my sister Leaf.
Hey guys!
And today we're here with the fourth installment of Three Guys Named Retro and the Game Hunters, our collaboration series with Mr. Water Music Retro, Retro Remix Nation, and Retro J. Pretty cool, huh?
Yeah!
So this is the fourth installment, as I just said, and if you want to check out the first three installments, go ahead over to Retro J's channel, Water Music Retro's channel, and Retro Remix Nation's channel, and check out those installments. So the topic this time around, as you probably caught on to by our little intro skit there, is talking about the 16-bit era wars, and what side were you on? Were you on Team Nintendo, or were you on Team Sega? And you guys probably have an idea of where we stand already. So Leaf, during that era, like Super Nintendo / Sega Genesis era, where did you stand? What team were you on?
I was more for Nintendo
Yep.
because of Mario and
Zelda and...
Zelda and
Yep.
Paperboy and all that.
And during that era, all my friends had a Super Nintendo, and I was the only one on the block that had a Sega Genesis, and I was very happy with my decision. Sonic just kind of really solidified my love for Sega, the sense of speed, and just kind of a little bit more of a mature edge to them than, say, Mario, and then, of course, games like Mortal Kombat that allowed you to have blood instead of on Super Nintendo where it was censored. As a young boy, I thought that was pretty cool. And, of course, if I wanted to play Super Nintendo, I would just go over to my buddy's house and play it there. So during the whole 16-bit era wars, although I think we both have a lot of appreciation for both Nintendo and Sega,
Oh yeah.
I was Team Sega, Leaf was Team Nintendo.
Oh yeah.
So why don't we throw it over to our buddy Retro Remix Nation and see what he has to say.
What's going on, guys? It's been so long since I was able to make any kind of video whatsoever. I've been working 2 full-time jobs and putting in about 80 hours a week, so I apologize for the lapse in content. I really do. But today, this is for the Game Hunters. We are doing a Sega Nintendo 16-bit war to see who liked what the best back in the day. And for me, it had to be Nintendo. And I'll tell you why. Because Nintendo kind of captured the essence of, like, being a kid, what it's like to grow up and want something and the desire to have it. I mean, Sega was Sega. Sega came into the war, in my opinion, with Mortal Kombat when they offered blood as opposed to Super Nintendo, which didn't offer blood. And that's kind of how the competition began. But for me, Nintendo is freaking Nintendo, man. The way the carts were shaped, the grayness of them, the beautiful artwork, just the nostalgia of it, the fact that the stupid consoles are made like VCRs, you gotta push them down and blow on them. What you gotta do with Sega too, I understand that, but I think the Mario aspect, the Zelda aspect, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Now I know there was like Hyperstone Heist on Genesis and stuff, but Nintendo kind of captured everything that I wanted as a kid. And when they first came onto the market, they actually deployed their system as a toy. That's why they put Rob the Robot in there, because after Atari crashed the market, it was so hard to bring a video game system back in, but they were able to do it. So they kind of pioneered their way, and I feel like Sega kind of jumped on the bandwagon to grab as much money off Nintendo's hands as possible. Now, back in the day, obviously, I didn't care about that. I just wanted to play something. And Nintendo was what we had in our household. My mom found one at a garage sale, and that's where it all started. I had Segas at my other friend's house. I love Sega to death, don't get me wrong, but when it comes to where my heart is, where it's always been Nintendo. Now I'm sorry this video couldn't be longer, but there is good news. I don't know if you can see all these games back here. We just got those in over the weekend, and I've yet to get to price them, and I ended up waking up way too early. I went to bed around 11, woke up around 2 a.m., and now I'm here getting ready to go to my other job in about an hour and a half, but I'm going to try to get so much pricing done. But coming up in about 5 weeks, this will be my main job, so that means I will have time to make content. God, I miss that. So look for that, guys, and please keep retro gaming alive. People, thank you.
Hey, what's up, YouTube? I guess it's my turn to talk about the big 16-bit war that happened in the early 90s when Super Nintendo came out. The Genesis was already out, and who was I with? Who did I back? Obviously, in 91, I think I was 13 years old, 14 years old, so I didn't have a job, so I wasn't out buying systems. But I grew up with, Atari, and then I got my Nintendo finally, and then right after that I just stuck with Super Nintendo. That doesn't mean I didn't play Sega or didn't enjoy Sega, but we had friends that would come over and wanted to borrow our Nintendo, and they let us borrow like the Master System. So I got some time in with the Master System. I thought it was a great system, but I was so used to my Nintendo. I had to have my Mario, I had to have my Zelda, I had to have my Metroid, all those games that made that system great. So once the 16-bit era happened, I wanted a Super Nintendo. I wanted Super Mario World because Mario was still one of my favorite games at the time. So I had to have Mario World. So I asked my parents, and I said, I want a Super Nintendo. So that Christmas, they bought us a Super Nintendo for me and my brother. I still actually have that Super Nintendo, but that's what we got. Really enjoyed Super Mario, and that was the only reason I wanted it. We got the Super Scope 6, I got Zelda Link to the Past, Super Metroid when it came out. All really great games that showed the power of the system. The system looked amazing. The sound was great. The graphics were better than the Genesis overall. I did get to play the Genesis though. Same people that we borrowed the Master System from, they must have just been, Sega people. They were older. They were my friends, or my mom's friends, So they always had the Sega system. So we got to borrow the Genesis, and that was the first time I ever played Sonic the Hedgehog. And we let them borrow the Super Nintendo so they could check out Mario. And, I admit I really liked Sonic, and I went through, they had Sonic 1 and 2 at the time, and I went through both of those and beat them, and they were excellent games. But the Super Nintendo overall won me over for the 16-bit war, and that's who I stuck with. And I bought Super Nintendo games long until after the 64 came out. When I got my first job in '94, and my very first check, I went out and bought a Super Game Boy for my Super Nintendo, so I could play all my Game Boy games on the Super Nintendo, which was really cool. I spent a ton of time on that, and just kept buying games. So my pick for the 16-bit war is the Super Nintendo. So thank you guys for watching, and let's move on to whoever's next.
Hello everybody, this is Water Music Retro, and I'm here today to talk to you a little bit about the 16-bit console wars of the early 1990s. Now I'll admit right off the cuff, for anybody who isn't familiar with me or my channel, I'm primarily a Nintendo guy these days. It was around my early 30s that I decided I was going to get back into retro games, and I decided, based on budget and space constraints, that I was going to stick with Nintendo consoles, as those are primarily the games that I remembered most from my youth. But that being said, I have a very flip-floppy past with the console allegiance. I didn't really have any allegiance, for that matter, to any console company, Sega, Nintendo, or even later Microsoft or Sony. I just always went for the one that I felt like playing the most, and I would buy and sell based on what I wanted at the time. I owned almost every major console up until about 2 generations ago. I stopped, that must have been about around the 360 that I stopped and just started focusing on Nintendo stuff. But before that, man, I was back and forth. So now that you understand that much about me, you'll understand why I didn't really stick with Nintendo or Sega during the 16-bit era. It all started when I guess I owned a Nintendo. I owned an NES console at the time when the 16-bit era started. Of course, I had a Master System before that, so Sega and Nintendo were both like home to me. I liked them both. My first major memory of the 16-bit era, as probably many people's is, would be Sonic the Hedgehog. I remember a friend of mine, I was visiting a friend of mine in Brantford. That was where my best friend lived, and I would go for sleepovers. They had a video store called Bandito Video, and I have very fond memories of this place because you could go there and they had not only game rentals, but they had a huge rental area where you could go and try out the games before you rent them. And they had, as soon as Sega Genesis came out, they had a Sega Genesis set up on a TV with Sonic the Hedgehog. And so we would go, and I think you could pay per half hour, and it was a really reasonable rate. Of course, his mom paid for us, and we stood there and played Sonic the Hedgehog straight, and my eyes were glued to the TV. I just couldn't believe how fast and shiny and colorful the game was, and it just stuck with me. That Christmas, he got a Sega Genesis and I got a Game Boy, and I was super jealous of him. I wanted a Sega Genesis so bad, but not to be. I got a Game Boy instead that year, and that was enough to hold me off. So after months and months of me dreaming about a Sega Genesis and Sonic the Hedgehog, fast forward to, I believe it was the next fall, and one of my dad's friends got a Super Nintendo. Now, this was an older, obviously a guy more my dad's age, but he was still into video games. So of course when this guy would come over, I would talk video games with him like he was a kid. It was kind of cool at the time. My dad thought it was weird, but I liked it. I thought it was fun. And sure enough, when he comes over the next time, he brings his Super Nintendo. And so he plugs it in for me and my friend to play. We played Super Mario World and Final Fight, and both of them absolutely just threw me through a loop. I couldn't believe how amazing that console was. So of course after that I'm thinking, alright, we got Christmas coming up soon. Do I want a Sega Genesis or do I want a Super Nintendo? I gotta get one of them, it's time. Let's make the jump to 16-bit. And of course then I started seeing the advertisements on TV. There was one in particular where they showed, I think, F-Zero, Legend of Zelda, Link to the Past, Super Mario World, and Pilot Wings, like all the big launch titles.
Decide to step up to this kind of power, this kind of challenge, this kind of flying, crashing feeling. When you decide to get serious, there's only one place to come: the games of Super Nintendo. No one else creates this kind of experience, because no one else creates these kinds of games. Now you're playing with power, superpower.
And that was it. I was sold. I had to get a Super Nintendo. There was no question about it at that point. I made the jump and I asked Santa Claus for a Super Nintendo and I got one. So a couple of years and a slew of games later that I ended up getting for the Super Nintendo, I loved it for what it was, and it brought me a lot of joy over the couple of years that I had it, but I flip-flopped, as I always did, and I thought, oh, you know, I wish I still had a Genesis, because all my friends were playing these great sports games on Genesis. They had great, the Genesis had the best hockey games, football games, baseball games, and still Sonic, which Nintendo didn't have, and so I kind of wish I had those games at the time, because I wanted my friends to come over and play, because that was the cool thing to do, right? So I decided, you know what, I'm going to sell my Super Nintendo with Zelda and these RPGs I have and these great games and get a Sega Genesis Model 2 system with Joe Montana Sports Talk Football. And thus ended the worst trade I ever made in my video game history. A Super Nintendo with chock full of great titles for a Sega Genesis Model 2 and a football game. Oh, I think I got Sonic the Hedgehog 3 too, which is a great game, but not nearly worth what I traded for it. So anyways, I was happy at the time. I thought, yay, I finally have my Sega Genesis that I never got at launch, and I can play these sports games now with my friends. They can bring their games over and we can play multiplayer. So it fit the need at the time. I got multiple controllers for it, and you know, it was it was fun. But fast forward to adulthood, and now being the Nintendo guy I am, I kick myself in the butt now and then for that trade. That was pretty silly of me, but at the time, you know, it made sense. So whatever. I mean, you know, a kid's got to do what he's got to do. To be honest, I didn't keep the Sega Genesis all that long. I think I ended up hawking it for some CDs or something down the line. I started getting out of games for a little bit after that, so I didn't really hang on to it all that long. So of course, all in all, with the 16-bit console wars, I would have two views. My first view would be from childhood, and that would be I like them both equally. I wanted to have them both at the same time as a kid. Of course, I never had that luxury, but I did have them both at different times, and I enjoyed them both for different reasons. So I think both consoles kicked butt in their own way. But fast forward as an adult, and I'm going to pick the Super Nintendo because it does hold more nostalgic value for me. Its lineup of RPGs and action fighters, shoot 'em ups, the list goes on, platformers. It's got all the games that I would want to play at this point in my life, minus the Sonic games, of course. So that's basically my thoughts on the 16-bit wars. Looking back, it's quite funny to see how intense they got for a little while there. But I guess history told the tale, and Nintendo ended up coming out on top overall. I mean, Sega, they're a shell of what they used to be these days, which is really sad because I kind of wish they were still making consoles. It'd be nice to see some more competition for the three biggies being Nintendo, Sony, and Microsoft. So thank you very much for tuning in to my views on the 16-bit console wars. And as always, stay retro, my friends.